Good morning, everybody. My name is Bincheng Mao, founder and chief editor of Inclusion Advocate. I'm so honored to be here today to speak with Dr. Condoleezza Rice, who is the former Secretary of State and current director of the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Dr. Rice, welcome to our program.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
I thought we'd start out this morning just talking about your insights into bridging America's political divide. Dr. Rice, back in 2014, when your official portrait was unveiled at the State Department, I remember then Secretary Kerry remarking that despite the hyper-partisanship in Washington, there's still a sense of special and mutual support and respect among secretaries of state from different political parties and different administrations. From your perspective, what accounts for this special sense of support and respect? And are any aspects to it that might be applicable to our society at large?
Well, I'm very glad that you've asked the question in that way, because I think there are very important lessons to be learned from what I'll call the brother and sisterhood of secretaries of state. First of all, if you want to be able to bridge differences, you have to have at root respect for one another. And very often when we have political differences, we forget that we need to respect each other, whatever our differing views. Secondly, it's very important to be able to put yourself in someone else's shoes. We very often are very focused on how we are affected by something. Someone said something to me that was offensive. They didn't understand where I was coming from. And there's an old idea from my childhood of what we called the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And so if you can sometimes just step back and say, let me put myself in that person's shoes. So when secretaries of state communicate with each other, they know what it's been like to be in some of those high pressure situations. And it gives you a sense of wanting to understand the other person. And then the final thing that I would say is try to find something in common with people who are different than you are. I'm a very big advocate for diversity and inclusion, but diversity doesn't have to mean difference. It can mean we come from very different backgrounds, we look different, but we have common goals, we have common aspirations. And I think if you keep that in mind as well, it'll help you to bridge differences with people who are different, may look different, may think differently, but it's important to have that common thread.
Speaking of embracing diversity, Dr. Rice, in your memoir, Extraordinary Ordinary People, you've described in detail the lessons you learned from your family about how to react to racism when you encounter it personally. At the time for you, it was in Birmingham, Alabama, during segregation. I'm wondering from your perspective, what do you hope young people today, many of whom have experienced intensified racism during this pandemic, Asian minorities for instance, what do you hope people today can take away from you in terms of how to respond to racism?
Well, I'm very concerned about this, and particularly, I think with the Asian American population, there's a particular burden that many other minorities don't recognize, that there are concerns and that there are prejudices that Asian Americans face. And so we've all been learning more about the various forms of prejudice and how they might express themselves. So as a society, we have to take on that prejudice. We have to say it's not acceptable, it's not okay. But as individuals, we can both stand up for what is right, but not let it destroy us as human beings, not let it destroy our sense of our ability to achieve. Now, admittedly, I grew up in segregated Birmingham, Alabama, which was about as racially charged as you could get. I lost a classmate, a kindergarten classmate, in the bombing of the Birmingham, the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, Denise McNair. Bombs went off in my neighborhood during 1963. And so I maybe come from a little different place with this. Had we let that destroy us, I would never have ended up where I am today. And so my parents always taught me to think of racism as somebody else's problem, not my problem. Not to think of myself as a lesser person because somebody else thought of me as a lesser person, and to speak up, to say to people, that was offensive. and then to give them an opportunity to understand why it was offensive. You will meet some bad people. You will meet some people who will say terrible things. You will meet people who do think less of you because you're a minority. But don't let it become your problem, and don't let it become a reason to doubt yourself.
Dr. Rice, in recent years, you've underscored repeatedly how imperative it is for the public to have faith in institutions in order to maintain a democracy. I'm wondering, from your vantage point, how do you view the relationship between keeping the public faith in institutions and institutional reform, including changes to potentially long-standing institutions?
I think we need to approach it in a couple of ways. The first is to recognize that institutional reform should be a natural part of democracy and a way of life. Things change. Sometimes institutions need to change with them. We are looking, for instance, at issues of police reform. We desperately need police reform. So accept and acknowledge that reform is necessary and natural, but then try to do it in the context of what is good about the institutions themselves. And so, particularly here in the United States, we have a constitution that has turned out to be very effective at allowing people to bring issues of discrimination, issues of reform. We have a saying that in the United States, Americans have what I think it was Madison called a spirit of constitutionalism, meaning that we actually think that the Constitution is our personal protector. And if we believe that we've been harmed, we will take you all the way to the Supreme Court, Brown versus the Board of Education. And so we have this connection to the Constitution. And I've always thought that one of the most remarkable things is that the Constitution, which once counted my ancestors as 3/5 of a man, that's how slaves were counted, that same Constitution would become the vehicle by which, with new amendments to it, you would get the emancipation of course, but also then you would get the great civil rights legislation of 64 and 65. And so the Constitution is a remarkable document, and recognizing how remarkable it is helps us to use it, because the problem with political change is that it can't just be the views of everyone. It can't just be an incoherent concept of change. It has to be channeled through something that will work. And so I hope that people will have respect for those institutions and work through them to bring about change.
Last, but certainly not least, let's discuss a topic that's so very dear to you and also to me, and that is education. Dr. Rice, you wrote recently that today, unfortunately, it is possible to look at someone's zip code and get a pretty accurate picture of how likely is this person to get a high quality public education. I'm wondering, from your perspective, what are some of the goals that we need to have, and what are some of the hopes that we can have in terms of education reform?
We need to recognize that there is nothing more important to democracy than the belief, and it has to be true, that every citizen can have a high quality education and reach their great potential. If you ever lose the sense that you can come from humble circumstances and do great things, democracy can't survive. And so education is the core of that. Now, our educational system is really failing some of our most vulnerable children. And I will tell you, I'm very worried coming out of COVID-19 about the learning loss, particularly among kids who perhaps didn't have parents who could help them with the work at home, because maybe the parents didn't even speak the language. It could be very difficult. So we're going to have to pay attention to helping them to catch up in a sense. But we also have to recognize that we need different options for parents. I am a believer in what is called the parental choice or the school choice movement, because the truth of the matter is people like me and my friends have choices for their children. They can move to a district where the schools are good and the houses are expensive. They can move and send their kids to private schools. So the people who really don't have choice are poor parents. And I believe that we have to have more charter schools. We have to have the ability to have vouchers for kids to go to private school. It's not that I'm not a believer in public education. I'm a great believer in public education. But we can't ignore the fact that while we are making the reforms to public education, we're losing generations of children. And so I believe giving their parents better choices, giving them high quality after school programs. I work with the Boys and Girls Clubs on after school programs. I think there's a lot we can do to make it better for the most underserved of our community.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rice, for your insights and for being on our program today. I'd like to close by wishing all our viewers good health during this difficult time. Thank you and take care.